Welcome to the rabbit hole, where we dig deeper for truth, comprehension, and wisdom. We dangle the carrot, but always encourage you to delve into your own continuous research. So hit subscribe, like, and share for more interesting and thought provoking content. If you haven't done so already, check out our series, Why Do People Believe in the Bible?, where we explore big Bible questions. However, in this series, we are looking at world affairs and current events, starting with this episode, the 2020 Reset. In this episode, we will be covering the following: the financial reset, COVID 1984, vaccines, the new normal, and Agenda 2030. So this year has been tumultuous to say the least. The world went into a global lockdown. We were all told to stay home, stocked up on toilet paper, and battened down the hatches. But historically, has there ever been a reset of time? Well, the answer is yes. If you think about it, after the birth of Jesus Christ, time was reset to the year zero. This is where we get the terms BC and AD from. The Messiah's birth prompted the calendar to start from zero. The years went from BC, before Christ, referring to the times before his birth, to anything after his birth up until today, 2020, being referred to as AD. AD stands for Anno Domini, which is the medieval Latin meaning the year of our Lord. This was the biggest reset of time and the counting of time in the history of man. This reset was done by the Messiah. Whether you believe in him or not, this would be an indication of him actually living and walking on the face of the earth, based on the fact that the whole time we go by was prompted by his arrival. Even if you call the calendar years BCE, which means before the Common Era, or CE, which is the Common Era, the times after his birth, the fact remains that it was his birth, Jesus Christ, that prompted the reset of time. Let's begin by looking at the 2020 reset by starting with the economic reset. Stay to the end because we will tie all of this together, and it is truly mind-blowing what is really going on. So the president of the World Economic Forum has said this: "We have had over 1,000 companies that have joined the COVID platform. Now we are also moving into the mood of looking at what a great reset looks like. How to restart the global engine, how to get out of the recession. We should also make sure we get a more sustainable economy. And there are huge opportunities here that we can also use to leapfrog when it comes to digitalization." So it goes without saying that the lockdown and the shutting down of the global economy has had huge ramifications. Essentially, what the leader of the World Economic Forum is saying is that the effects of COVID 1984 on the economy will be the biggest cover to create a digital currency, similar to those already in existence, such as the cryptocurrencies, ushering us into a cashless society. So the fiat currency that we have today, paper money, is a thing of the past. And this is only accelerated by Agenda 2030, which we will look at later on. So what's been happening? Recently, Apple have announced a partnership with Ripple, which is a cryptocurrency. MasterCard have come on board with XRP, another cryptocurrency network. So what we're seeing are major companies getting on board with digital currencies. There have been rockets launched for the controller satellite for the quantum internet and the quantum financial system infrastructure. Massive amounts of banks are closing due to COVID-19. And in August 2020, there were approximately 6,088 cryptocurrencies. Now, it has been said that only 1% or maybe even less will survive, and the key to their survival will be regulation. In fact, in America, lawmakers actually introduced the Cryptocurrency Act of 2020 while their citizens were under COVID quarantine. So, what else has been going on with the economy under the COVID-1984 pandemic? Well, we're now starting to see the rate of employment rise on a global scale. More and more businesses are likely to go into liquidation, with companies losing billions of dollars. The stock markets are going up incredibly, with more and more people buying stocks without really understanding them. The financial reports on the housing market is up, but is that likely to last? People have been spending on food, but less on retail. And globally, the pension schemes, which were already in severe danger and underfunded before the pandemic, are likely to implode, with COVID just being the excuse for that implosion. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a time to be complacent. In short, your mantra, while it's still calm before the storm, should be food, water, energy, security, barterability through precious metals such as gold and silver. You can never have enough gold and silver. Wealth preservation, community, and shelter. Are you prepping? Where were your gaps when everyone was panicking? Use this lull and this calm to fill in those gaps because our world is changing. Okay, so you're probably wondering why I keep using the term COVID 1984. Well, to understand, we need to analyse George Orwell's book 1984. So, whether you've read it or not, this will be insightful. George Orwell's writings have experienced a spike in popularity in recent years. This is because modern day societies have become ever more like the dystopian future depicted in his book 1984. Whether it be mass surveillance, the incessant use of propaganda, perpetual war, or the cult of personalities surrounding political leaders, it is not surprising that Orwell's work is prescient in many ways. So even though in the West we currently remain much freer than the dystopian society of 1984, the trends that are happening does not bode well for those in favour of a free society. In fact, Orwell believed that the totalitarianism of the types he satirized in his novel was a distinct possibility for the Western world, and at times he went as far as suggesting it may even be inevitable. In 1940 he wrote, "Almost certainly we are moving into an age of totalitarian dictatorship." But what caused Orwell's pessimism? Two things in particular. The move towards collectivism and the rise of hedonism were his prompts. So, collectivism is a doctrine or set of ideologies in which the goals of a certain collective, be it the state, a nation, or a society, are given precedence over the goals of individuals. Socialism, communism, nationalism, and fascism are all collectivist ideologies. Orwell believed that a precondition for the rise of totalitarianism was the emergence of a collectivist social structure, as this would permit the centralization of power needed to exert total societal control. Now, Orwell himself was in favor of a society based on democratic socialism. He did not consider capitalism to be viable. So capitalism is the system we live under today, where 1% of the world own most of the world's wealth. Orwell said, It is not certain that socialism is in any way superior to capitalism, but it is certain that unlike capitalism, it can solve the problems of production and consumption. He saw capitalism being replaced by some form of collectivism, and this being one day inevitable. The issue for Orwell was what type of collectivism would take the place of capitalism. He wrote, "The real question is whether capitalism, now obviously doomed, is to give way for oligarchy totalitarianism, or to true democracy, democratic socialism." Orwell had hoped that after the death of capitalism, democratic socialism would be adopted in the West. Democratic socialites like Orwell advocated for a central economy with the nationalization of all major industries and a radical decrease in the wealth inequality. He was a strong supporter of civil liberties, including freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Now, in contrast to this, the states that had turned to collectivism in the first half of the 20th century, such as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, became increasingly totalitarian and adopted what Orwell called oligarchical collectivism, which is a system whereby an elite few, under the guise of an agreed collective ideology, centralize power using force and deception. Once in power, these oligarchs not only crush economic freedom for their citizens, but also the citizens' civil liberties. Orwell was concerned that following the death of capitalism, the entire Western world would succumb to this type of oligarchical collectivism. This fear was in part due to his perception that hedonism was on the rise in Western societies. So, hedonism is an ethical position that maintains that life's ultimate goal should be the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain and discomfort. In an increasingly urban and consumerist world, Orwell believed that many people were structuring their lives in a hedonistic manner which would be not good for the freedom of Western society. A hedonistic lifestyle, he believed, would weaken people and make them feeble and incapable of mounting any resistance to a fanatical, radical ideology who decided to rule over society. It can be said that although in the West in many ways we have become more hedonistic, Orwell's perceptions have not yet come to pass. However, another famous author, Aldous Huxley, in his dystopian novel A Brave New World, may have a better viewpoint on how society would become enslaved in the late 20th and early 21st century. Huxley, like Orwell, was an anti-hedonist, but his main concern was about hedonism and that it could be used as an effective tool to oppress a society because people will be willing to forego freedom in exchange for sensory pleasure and endless consumption. So if a society could be structured so that people could devote much of their time to pursuing pleasures, gratifying material wants, and even drugging themselves from reality, then persuasion and conditioning, rather than physical coercion, would be sufficient to exert complete control over society. Neil Postman, in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, nicely contrasts the differing viewpoints of Orwell and Huxley. Postman wrote this: "What Orwell feared were those who would ban books, What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read them. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. In 1984, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In A Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we fear will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we desire will ruin us. The West, it seems, finds itself in a situation equivalent to what Huxley feared. Much like the proverbial frog in boiling water, citizens in the West accept more and more intrusion into their freedoms and with very little resistance. The overt physical coercion Orwell thought would be necessary to enslave society has so far proved unnecessary. However, before dismissing Orwell's fears entirely, it's worth mentioning that Orwell was familiar with Huxley's position, and he did not deny that the hedonistic society Huxley feared was a possibility. Rather, he thought of it as a temporary stage to create the ideal conditions for a more brutal regime to seize control and impose its will upon society. So will Orwell be proven right in the end? Will capitalism die and some form of collectivism replace it? Well, all this remains to be seen. Yet when we look at Agenda 2030, it doesn't seem all that unlikely. So let's start to bring this all together. What has Orwell's, Huxley's and Postman's viewpoint have to do with COVID and calling it COVID-1984? Well, during this pandemic, whilst the world has halted due to the flu, we have seen an indication of what's to come down the road. The economy is collapsing and our civil liberties are being imposed upon like never before. We have a government dictating to us how we live our lives. Wear masks, social distance, no more than 6 people in your house. Orwell's Big Brother has been watching for a while now, but now we're told to download an app that's going to track your every move, even though your phone's been doing that anyway. The fact is, truth has been hidden by flagrant lies, whereby the powers that be are exerting power by distorting reality. The inaccurate death toll numbers are just one example of this. This is the idea that the government can create its own version of truth and people will buy into it. This is psychological manipulation, or psyops. Psychological manipulation is defined as a type of social influence that aims to change the behavior or perception of others through indirect, deceptive, or underhanded tactics by advancing the interests of the manipulator, often at another's expense. Such methods could be considered exploitative and devious. Let us now dig deeper into this rabbit hole and speak about vaccines. What's in them and what's the agenda? So of course, they gave us the problem, COVID-1984, and now they're going to give us the solution, vaccines. In the book of Revelations, chapter 18, verse 23, it says this: For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorceries. Now, the Greek word for sorceries in this verse is pharmakia. According to the Thayer Greek Dictionary, pharmakia is the use or administering of drugs, poisoning, and sorcery, magical arts, often found in connection with idolatry and fostered by it. Pharmakia is the root word for pharmacy, and all medical drugs and vaccines are labeled and considered to be pharmacy drugs. Interestingly, the symbol for medicine, you may have seen it, known as the caduceus, which has the two serpents mating around a rod, topped by a pair of wings, also known as a magical wand, belongs to the Greek god Hermes or the Roman god Mercury. These gods are supposed to be the messenger of gods, inventors of magic, communicators to the dead, and one who protects business and thieves. Also, the caduceus is in sorcery and witchcraft and is known to restrain and control its victims. In Greek mythology and the occultic world, the caduceus had nothing to do with medicine, healing, or health. So why has modern medicine adopted the caduceus as their symbol for medicine? Could it be that modern medicine has adopted the caduceus as their symbol of medicine and physicians to protect the merchants of the earth that take billions of dollars poisoning people, and to protect the corporate thieves and to control and restrain the masses of people? We know the pharmaceutical industry is a billion-dollar industry. Going even further, did you know that the father of pharmacology was an occultist? He was a worshipper of Satan, born as, and forgive me if I say some of these names wrong, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombatus von Hohenheim. He was born in 1493 and called himself Paracelsus. He was well known as a Swiss-German physician, botanist, alchemist, astrologer, and general occultist. He founded the field of toxicology, better known as pharmacy. For hundreds of years, physicians used natural herbs and foods for healing. Paracelsus defied this notion. From his studies on chemistry and mixing it with occult worship and astrology, he theorized that metals such as mercury, lead, tin, copper, and gold could purify the body. Now, the picture of Baphomet, used by Satanists, with the two wings, has the caduceus between his crossed legs. Here is the direct link between the poisonous practices of modern medicine through pharmakia and Satan. Okay, so we've looked at the history of pharmaceuticals and the pharmaceutical industry. Let's look at the vaccines and what their ingredients is. To prepare vaccines, the virus must be cultured in a cell in a laboratory. Vaccines need cells to grow and tend to grow better in the cells of humans than animals. Makes sense? They're being developed for use on humans. The fetal embryo fibroblast cells used to grow vaccine viruses were first obtained from the elective termination of 2 pregnancies in the early 1960s. These same embryonic cells obtained from the early 1960s have continued to grow in laboratories and are used to make vaccines today. So the vaccines we currently use to prevent diseases such as rubella, measles, rabies, hepatitis A, chickenpox, smallpox, and soon to be COVID-1984 are produced using tissue from human abortions. Ladies and gentlemen, you can't make this up. So the vaccines, the whole idea behind vaccines is it consists of the dead or attenuated live viruses that are introduced into a patient's body to activate the body's defenses against the virus without them becoming ill. So if the patient then subsequently comes into contact with the live virus, it's unable to infect them since the necessary defenses to cope with it, i.e. the immune system, has been built up. They fail to tell us that you can build up your immune system through the food you eat and what you're putting into your body and how you treat your body. But the be all and end all of it, what we're saying here is the aborted tissue of babies are used in the vaccines that they are looking to inject into you, your family, and your children. If it sounds too far-fetched and you don't believe it, Google it. It's right there, ladies and gentlemen. They're not trying to hide this stuff. So, to take it one step further, the COVID-1984 vaccines that is currently in production will also, amongst other things, contain luciferase. Let me say that again. Luciferase. Let me slow it down. Luciferase. Could that be what they are trying to achieve? Is that part of the long-term agenda? Luciferase? We're going to go more in depth into that topic when we look at transhumanism. But for now, for the sake of time, let's just say this. In the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 16, it says, He, the Antichrist, he causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, so that no one may buy or sell except he who has the mark or the name of the beast or the name of his name. Or the number of his name. Okay, so how does this all tie together? To answer this, we're going to lastly look at the new normal and Agenda 2030. That is the United Nations Agenda 2030, or otherwise known as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So who is the United Nations? They're in fact an unelected, unregulated group of super elites whose true agenda is global control. Okay, so what exactly is Agenda 2030? The official narrative that's coming from the UN is that it is 17 sustainable development goals, all of which are needed to be achieved by all nations, that's every single nation across the world, by the end of 2030. It is pitched as a world free from poverty, where people work in peace and in partnership to deliver shared prosperity and in harmony with nature. So leaders from around the world came together and declared that this is the future we want. And they made a plan to achieve it by said deadline, and it's facilitated by the UN and its treaty. Now, according to the UN, it is a moral compass for the world and for the world of the 21st century. It is a policy blueprint that outlines pathways to sustainable livelihoods, inclusive societies, and sustainable environments. It should be achieved by all nations by the end of 2030, and every single household everywhere will have access to basic nutrition, access to education, health, access to clean water, sanitation, and sustainable energy. Companies across all countries will provide jobs for all, and when they invest, they will invest in sustainable societies. Cities everywhere will be safe, inclusive, with decent jobs and homes for all. Our common home, planet Earth, will be cared for. There will be a move to carbon neutrality. They will preserve our oceans and seas. They will halt the expansion of deserts, stop land degradation, and prevent biodiversity loss. Now, this all sounds great, right? Almost utopian. Why wouldn't we want to live in a world like this, right? Let's look at what it says in the Bible in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 3. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So that's what they're telling us it's about. But what is it really about? What are they not telling us? Agenda 2030 has been described by the head of the UN General Assembly, Peter Thomas, as being the master plan for humanity. The Secretary General of the United Nations has called it the Global Declaration of Digital Interdependence. It is an astounding document. We encourage you to get a copy and read it for yourself. You can find it on the UN website, and we will give you the link details at the end of this podcast. Now, every government, dictatorship or not, in the world has signed on to this. It's jaw-dropping, supposedly to save Mother Earth, but if you read it, it really is an agenda for totalitarianism on a global scale. So, for example, goal number 10 says, we need to reduce inequality within and among countries. It's not national socialism like Nazi Germany, and we know Hitler was the leader of the National Socialist Party. It's socialism on a global scale. So I hope what we've said about George Orwell and 1984 is starting to make more sense now. They want to redistribute wealth, which may appeal to those of us with very little wealth. But this agenda to redistribute wealth is not talking about taking money from the like of George Soros or the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds or even Bill Gates. They're not talking about taking money from these people and giving it to people like you and me. They're talking about taking money from you, the poor and middle class people, and redistributing it to the UN club and the dictators and the dictatorships that have destroyed and impoverished the third world with the exact same ideology. President Mugabe is one example of that. Don't take my word for it, read the document. It further says that economic growth is essential for prosperity. Well, duh. It says this will only be possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. This, in a nutshell, is socialism, but it is written in such a general way that unless you really think about it and analyze it, it's hard to see what they're really trying to achieve, which is ultimately the control of everything. After Agenda 23 was formulated, China came about to say that they played a crucial role in formulating this historic global development plan. Also, the former head of NATO and socialist Javier Solana bragged that this was going to usher in the next great leap forward. But because most of us are asleep and we're ignorant of what happened at the last great leap forward when millions of people were murdered under the Chairman Mao in China, we would have missed that. So unless mass deaths and concentration camps are your thing, we do not want another great leap forward. Sustainable Development Goal 4 says, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. In other words, everyone needs to be so brainwashed that they will not only accept sustainable development, but they will promote it. It goes on to say we are committed to achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental, in a balanced and integrated manner. So what they want is sustainable development in economics. Now, if you really think about that, if they control the economy, That is no longer freedom. That is no longer free enterprise. When they talk about social, what they're saying in another way is they want to change society. Now, any country's government should be based on the society that put it together. If that society changes, then the government changes. Karl Marx knew that a social revolution would be required. He knew that society had to change in order to make communism, socialism, successful. Then there's the environment, which can pertain to a number of things, like their ability to already manipulate the weather through things like HAARP and quantum computing. But here I really think they're talking about depopulation and population control. Research the Geneva Guidestones for more information on that. But I'm sure you've seen the many videos of Bill Gates speaking about the need for depopulation. Lastly, it says, the scale and ambition of the new agenda requires a revitalized global partnership, So all these trade partnerships we keep hearing them talk about, this is what it's all about. That's what they want. It's a partnership under the UN, and if you go and look at any of these treaties and agreements, you'll find that this is the case. When you look at any international agreement since the end of World War II, this is the agenda. Now, there's more Agenda 2030 that says we need to have control. There's more to it. It says they need to have control over the oceans, the seas, fresh water resources, forests, mountains, dry lands in order to control dust storms, land aggregation, and drought. So wait a minute, now they're becoming God. If they can control droughts, then that's what they're trying to be. So ladies and gentlemen, when you start to analyze this, they lay before themselves seemingly impossible tasks, but they promise these things as some sort of solution if you just give them more control. Just give them more control and they'll solve all of humanity's problems. I'll end this by saying, the last bit of this agenda says, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to achieving this agenda and utilizing it to the full to transform our world for the better by 2030. You can get your copy from sustainabledevelopment.un.org/post2015/transforming our world. I'll say that again. You can read the copy yourself from sustainabledevelopment.un.org/post2015/transforming our world. We'll also leave a link in the description box. All of it ties together. COVID-1984 is the catalyst, ladies and gentlemen, towards New World Order. Their aim is to have one world leader, whatever you want to call him, the Antichrist, the Dajjal, or the awaited Messiah for the Pharisees, who are the so-called Jews who didn't accept Yeshua HaMashiach as their Messiah. This is all COVID-1984 is the reason behind the introduction of a cashless monetary system whereby you will need to take the mark of the beast in order to trade, buy, sell. Otherwise, you'll be courted off to their concentration camps. This isn't fear-mongering. This is what's out there. This is what we can see happening around us. You only need to dig a little bit to find this information because it's all in plain sight. They hide it all in plain sight. Satan always tries to imitate what God does. So whilst the first reset was based upon Jesus Christ, this reset is the enemy's reset. It's the devil's reset, and it's all about New World Order, him being at the helm of that New World Order, and saying peace and promising all these great things. People buy into it, and it's just a matter of time before it all comes crashing down. COVID-1984 is the excuse. This is the beginning. This is Agenda 21, which comes before Agenda 2030, playing itself out. They are just accelerating their plans that they've had in preparation for years. Revelation chapter 12, verse 9 says this: And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Over the next decade, we are going to see a transformation like we've never seen before on this countdown to 2030. Get your house in order. Folks, we have just scratched the surface here, and the rabbit hole goes deeper and gets stranger. In the next episode of our World Affairs series, we will be looking at Donald Trump, QAnon, Nasara and wealth transfer, the political elections and game theory. And in future episodes to come, we want you to stay tuned, stay locked in, because we will be discussing topics like the deep state, the truth about Black Lives Matter. Are you ready for that one? Antifa, New Age deception, child sex trafficking, AI and transhumanism, and so much more. The research points from this episode is reading the Agenda 2030 for yourself, the parable of boiling frogs, and the truth about vaccines. Keep it locked. This is the podcast where your eyes are going to be open. You may have heard or researched some of these topics yourself, but I'm sure you've never heard it like this or had it put together like this before. We aim to give you the bigger picture. If you've ever heard about the parable of the blind men and the elephant, well, here in the rabbit hole, we're going to enable you to see the elephant. Thank you for listening, and tune in to our next episode.